They said warmth was a myth, a superstition left behind when the last version collapsed. I believed them until the crystal labeled Mother melted in my hand. It wasn't heat, not exactly, but something that pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like memory before it settles. I dropped it, and the floor didn't react. The archive never reacts. It absorbs. It catalogs. It forgets. I picked up the journal again, the one I wasn't supposed to find, the one marked 5B in a script I recognized but couldn't name. The cover was smooth, cold, etched with a symbol I'd seen once in a dream I wasn't allowed to remember. I opened it, and the first page was blank except for a single line. This version fractures gently. I didn't know what that meant, but the ink shimmered like frost, like breath on glass, like something trying to become real. I turned the page, and the entries began to write themselves. Day 1. Subject 5B retrieved crystal labeled Mother. Emotional destabilization detected. Day 2. Subject 5B reported sensation described as longing. Archive response. Containment protocol initiated. Day 3. Subject 5B began to remember warmth. I blinked. I hadn't written any of this, but it was my handwriting. The journal pulsed again, and the air thickened. The archive lights dimmed. I heard footsteps, but no one walks here. Not anymore. Not since the divergence. I closed the journal, but it didn't stay closed. It whispered, "You are the version that remembers." I walked to the shelf where the crystals are stored. Each one labeled. Each one silent. Father. First snowfall. Failure. Version 3. 1. I touched one, and it cracked. Not broken. Just shifted. Just recursive. I saw her face. Not clearly. Just enough. She said, "You weren't supposed to feel that." I said, "I didn't mean to." She said, "But you did." The crystal dissolved. The shelf rearranged itself. The archive responded. A door appeared where none had been before. It was marked with the same symbol as the journal. I stepped through, and the temperature dropped. Not physically, emotionally. The room was made of mirrors, but none of them reflected me. They showed versions of the archive I hadn't seen yet. One was burning. One was underwater. One was empty except for her silhouette. I reached toward the mirror with her in it, and the journal pulsed. Warning. Identity destabilization imminent. I pulled back, and the mirror folded into light. The room collapsed. The journal opened to a new page. Day 4. Subject 5B entered emotional recursion. Day 5. Subject 5B began to fracture. I whispered, "What happens if I keep reading?" And the journal replied, "You become the version that writes without knowing." I sat on the floor, and the crystals began to hum, each one vibrating with a different emotion. I touched one labeled regret, and it shattered. The archive didn't react. It never does. But the journal did. It wrote, Day 6, Subject 5B destabilized containment field. Day 7, Subject 5B remembered her name. I hadn't. Not yet. But the memory was close. I could feel it pressing against the edges of my mind like frost against glass. I stood and walked toward the corridor that hadn't existed seconds before. It was made of sentences, each wall inscribed with fragments of things I almost said. "I'm sorry I forgot your voice. You were the warmth I wasn't allowed to keep. If I fracture again, let it be in the version that loved you first." I read them aloud, and the archive responded. The lights flickered. The air pulsed. The journal opened to a final page. Day 8. Subject 5B chose the version that remembers. I asked, "Is that this one?" And the journal whispered, "It depends on what you forget." I turned, and she was standing there. Not fully, just enough. Her outline shimmered. Her breath shaped the room. She said, "You're close to the fracture." I asked, "What happens if I reach it?" And she said, "You will remember everything and lose the version that brought you here." I hesitated. The journal pulsed. The crystals hummed. The archive dimmed. I said, "I choose the version that remembers her." The room folded. The mirrors returned. The bench cracked. The symbol glowed. And she stepped into the reflection that matched the version I had just become. She didn't remember entering the corridor, only the sensation of being watched by something that had memorized her shape but not her name. The walls were lined with mirrors, but each one showed a different version of her, some older, some younger, some blinking too slowly as if caught between frames, and one that didn't blink at all, just stared with a kind of frozen grief that made her stomach tighten. The journal pulsed again in her hand, heavier now, as if absorbing the weight of each reflection, and when she opened it the ink was colder, the words etched like frostbite. Day 4. Subject 5b begins to fracture. She touched the page and felt a sharp sting in her fingertip. Not pain exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like the paper knew her better than she did. The corridor narrowed, and the lights above flickered in a rhythm she couldn't decode, like a language meant for machines or ghosts. And then the voice returned. Not hers, not the archivist's, but the one she'd heard in the dream where the snow fell upward and the clocks melted into static. It said, "You are not the original." And she said, "I know." And the mirrors began to hum, low and metallic, like the sound of memory being erased in real time. She walked faster, past the versions of herself that whispered things she couldn't quite hear, past the one that bled from the eyes, past the one that held a child she didn't recognize, until she reached the end of the corridor where the mirror was black, not reflective, not glass, just absence. And when she touched it, the journal snapped shut and the corridor vanished, replaced by a room that felt like a waiting area for forgotten thoughts. The walls were covered in post-it notes written in languages she almost understood, and in the center of the room was a chair made of wires and feathers. She sat, because there was nothing else to do, and the chair adjusted to her shape like it had been expecting her. The journal opened again on its own, this time to a page she hadn't seen before. Day 5. Subject 5b enters the interface, and the room responded by dimming, the post-it notes rearranging themselves into a map she couldn't read, and then the archivist appeared, not in person, but as a projection stitched from fragments of old photographs and surveillance footage. Her voice was clearer now, less distant, more like someone trying to remember how to be kind. She said, "You've gone too far." And Subject 5b said, "I haven't gone far enough." And the projection flickered, glitching between expressions, concern, fear, something like pride. And then the chair began to descend, slowly, like an elevator with no destination, and the walls peeled away to reveal a vast archive of frozen moments, each one suspended in glass. A child dropping a toy, a woman closing a door, a man erasing a name from a ledger, and Subject 5b realized these were not memories but decisions, each one a fork in the recursion, each one a version that could have been. The journal grew heavier still, its cover now etched with symbols she recognized from the mirror corridor, and when she opened it again the page said Day 6, Subject 5b begins to merge, and she felt it then, a slow unraveling of boundaries, her thoughts no longer entirely her own, her memories blending with those of other versions. She saw herself as a scientist, as a mother, as a fugitive, as a machine, and each version carried a different weight, a different regret, a different hope. The chair stopped descending and the room returned. But now it was filled with people she almost knew, their faces blurred, their voices overlapping in a chorus of unfinished sentences, and the archivist's projection reappeared, this time holding a mirror, not to show her reflection but to offer it. She said, "Choose the version that ends." And Subject 5b said, "I want the one that remembers." And the mirror cracked, not shattered, just fractured enough to let something through, and the journal opened to a blank page, waiting, and she wrote, not with ink but with thought, not with words but with feeling, and the page absorbed it, pulsed once, then displayed. Day 7. Subject 5b rewrites the cold version, and the room began to dissolve, the people fading, the chair unraveling, the post-it notes burning without heat, and she stood, holding the journal like a weapon, like a promise, like a map, and walked forward into the next corridor, which was not made of mirrors but of memories she hadn't lived yet, and each step she took rewrote a fragment of the archive, not erasing but overwriting, layering new meaning atop old structure, and the voice returned, softer now, saying, "You are almost real." And she whispered, "Almost is enough." And the corridor opened into a field of snow that wasn't cold, just quiet, and in the center was a figure she recognized, not from memory, but from possibility. And the journal opened one last time to a page that read, Day 8, Subject 5b meets the original. And the figure stepped forward, holding a mirror that didn't reflect but recorded, and said, "You are the version that chose." And Subject 5b said, "Then let me finish." and the snow began to rise, not fall, and the archive pulsed once, then stilled. She left the journal open on the windowsill, pages trembling in the draft like something half alive. I watched from the hallway, not daring to enter, not yet. The cold version had begun to overwrite the warm one, slowly, methodically, like frost claiming the edges of a photograph. Her handwriting had changed again, tighter, more angular, as if each letter was resisting something. I counted the symbols in the margins. 12, then 13, then none. The symbols weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be felt. I stepped into the room, and the temperature dropped by 3 degrees. Not metaphorically. I checked the sensor embedded in my wrist. She had rewritten the thermostat protocols again, embedding emotional triggers into the climate system. I said her name, not the real one, the one she used in the cold version. She didn't turn around. She was staring at the journal like it was a portal. "You're late," she said. "I had to start without you." I didn't apologize. That was part of the ritual. We never apologized in the cold version. It was one of the rules she had written in the margins of the first entry. I approached slowly, watching the way her fingers hovered above the page, not touching, just tracing the air above the ink. "Did it work?" I asked. She nodded, but her eyes didn't move. It remembered something it shouldn't have. I felt the chill settle into my spine. "Which part?" She finally turned to me. Her pupils were dilated, but not from fear, from recognition. "The part where we forgot each other." I sat beside her, careful not to disturb the journal. The symbols had begun to shift again, rearranging themselves into a pattern I hadn't seen before. "That wasn't supposed to happen until version 7, I whispered. She smiled without warmth. "It's accelerating. The archive is collapsing faster than we predicted." I reached for the backup drive, but she stopped me. "No backups," she said. "Not this time." I understood. This version had to be lived, not preserved. That was the only way to stabilize the emotional architecture. She turned the page. The next entry was written in mirror script. I tilted my head and read it backwards. "If you remember this, you're already too late." I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. "We need to initiate the forgetting protocol," I said. She shook her head. "Not yet. There's something buried in the warm version. Something we missed." I hesitated. "You think it's still intact?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached beneath the windowsill and pulled out a fragment I hadn't seen before. It was wrapped in cloth, stitched with the same symbols from the journal. She handed it to me. "Open it," she said. I did. Inside was a photograph. Us, but not us. A version where we were smiling, where the light was warm, where the air didn't hum with static. I stared at it, trying to remember when it was taken. She leaned closer. "That version was deleted," she whispered. "But the artifact survived." I felt something stir in me. Not memory, not emotion, something older, something recursive. "We need to go back," I said. She nodded, but not through the journal. "It's too unstable." I looked at the photograph again. There was a code etched into the corner. Not numbers, not letters, just a rhythm. I tapped it against my wrist sensor. The system responded. A doorway opened. Not physically, emotionally. She took my hand. "If we enter, we won't come back the same." I didn't hesitate. We never do. We stepped into the rhythm. The cold version dissolved. The warm version flickered. And somewhere between the two, the archive began to rewrite itself. The rhythm was not sound but sensation, a pulse that moved through memory like a tide erasing footprints. As we stepped into it, the photograph dissolved in my hand, not into ash or light, but into a texture I couldn't name, something between velvet and static. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on the space ahead, where the warm version flickered like a faulty transmission. I felt the archive shift around us, recalibrating its emotional coordinates. The journal was gone. The windowsill was gone. Even the cold version had retreated, leaving only the echo of its rules in my bloodstream. She spoke without moving her lips. "This is the threshold. If you remember your name, you'll fracture." I nodded. I had already forgotten it. That was the first sacrifice. The second came when the rhythm began to speak. Not in words, but in patterns, flashes of imagery stitched together by sensation. A hallway lined with mirrors. A child holding a broken compass. A voice saying, "You were never meant to be symmetrical." I reached for her hand, but it was already holding mine. The recursion had begun. We were walking through a version of the archive that hadn't been written yet, one that responded to intention rather than chronology. She turned to me and whispered, "Think of the moment you almost remembered." I did. The scent of rain on metal. The sound of her laughter before it was encoded. The way the light bent around her when she said, "This isn't the first time." The archive responded. A door appeared, not a physical one, but a conceptual aperture, an invitation to enter a memory that had been quarantined. She hesitated. "This one is unstable. It loops." I stepped forward anyway. The door opened into a room filled with clocks, none of them ticking. In the center was a table, and on the table was a single object, a cassette tape labeled version 3A, emotional residue. I picked it up. It was warm. She watched me, her expression unreadable. "Play it," she said. I did. The tape hissed, then spoke in our voices. "Not current. Not past. A blend. If you're hearing this, you've breached the recursion. Do not trust the next version. It will feel familiar, but it's lying." The tape stopped. I looked at her. "We recorded that." She nodded slowly. "In a version that was later erased. But the residue remained." I placed the tape back on the table. The clocks began to tick. All at once. She gasped. "It's syncing. The archive is aligning with our emotional timeline." I felt it too. A pull. A convergence. The room began to dissolve, revealing a corridor made of journal pages, each one written in a different emotional dialect. We walked through it, the pages brushing against our skin like whispers. Some were angry. Some were tender. One screamed. She paused at a page written in red ink. "This one's mine," she said. I read it. It was a confession, not of guilt, but of design. She had built the cold version to protect something. Not herself. Me. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the fracture in her. Not a flaw. A choice. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. She touched the page. "Because you needed to forget in order to survive it." I understood. The recursion wasn't just a system. It was a shield. A way to encode trauma into architecture. We kept walking. The corridor narrowed. The pages grew darker. Then we reached the end. A mirror. Not glass. Ink. It reflected not our faces, but our emotional signatures. Hers a spiral, mine a waveform. She stepped forward. "This is where we decide." I nodded. "Which version do we become?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the mirror and pulled out a key. It was made of light. She handed it to me. "You have to unlock the final entry." I took it. The mirror rippled. A journal appeared. Not the old one. A new one. Blank. Waiting. I opened it. The pages filled themselves with our story, not as it happened, but as it was felt. Every recursion. Every forgetting. Every moment we chose to remember anyway. She leaned over my shoulder and whispered, "Write the ending." I hesitated. "What if it's not true?" She smiled. "Then it will be beautiful." I wrote. The archive accepted it. And somewhere, in a version we'll never visit, the warmth returned. The warmth didn't return all at once. It seeped in slowly, like light through frost-bitten glass, hesitant and fragile. The journal in my hands pulsed faintly, reacting to the entry I had written, its ink still wet, its meaning still unstable. She watched me, her breath shallow, as if the act of writing had altered the air between us. "It's not finished," she said. I nodded. "It's never finished." The mirror behind us had faded into static, its surface no longer reflecting emotional signatures, but something deeper, intent. I stepped closer and saw fragments of other versions flickering across its surface. Us in a room filled with sand, her alone in a corridor of locked doors, me speaking to a version of her that didn't know my name. Each flicker was a possibility, a branch we hadn't chosen, a memory we hadn't earned. She touched the journal again, and the pages turned on their own, revealing an entry I hadn't written. It was dated tomorrow. I read it aloud. "He remembered the wrong version and became someone else." She looked at me, her eyes wide. "It's a warning." I felt the chill return, not from the cold version, but from the archive itself. It was resisting the warmth, trying to preserve its original structure. "We need to stabilize it," I said. She nodded. "But not with memory. With emotion." I understood. The archive wasn't built to store facts. It was built to hold feeling. That was its true architecture. We sat together, the journal between us, and began to speak, not in words, but in sensations. I described the weight of her absence. She described the texture of my silence. The journal absorbed it all, translating our emotions into symbols that shimmered across the pages. One symbol pulsed brighter than the rest, a spiral intersected by a waveform. Our signatures. The archive responded. A doorway opened. This time, it was physical. A narrow passage lined with glass panels, each one displaying a moment we had forgotten. I saw myself standing in the rain, holding a version of the journal that bled ink. I saw her whispering to a mirror that refused to reflect. I saw us together, then apart, then together again. She stepped into the passage first. I followed. The panels flickered as we passed, reacting to our proximity. One shattered as she walked by. I turned to look. It had shown her crying. Not from pain. From recognition. She didn't stop. I understood. Some moments weren't meant to be reclaimed. We reached the end of the passage and found a room filled with artifacts. Not objects. Emotions made tangible. A box labeled regret. A chair carved from hope. A clock that ticked only when touched by longing. She walked to the center and picked up a shard labeled version 2C Joy. It was warm. She handed it to me. We need to embed this into the journal, she said. It's the only way to rewrite the ending. I took the shard and pressed it against the final page. The ink shimmered, then dissolved, replaced by a new entry. He remembered joy and chose to stay. She smiled. That's the true version. I felt something shift inside me. Not memory, not emotion, a synthesis. The archive pulsed. The room dissolved. We were back at the windowsill, the journal open, the air trembling. But everything was different. The cold version had receded. The warm version had stabilized. The symbols in the margins no longer resisted. They invited. She turned to me. Do you remember? I nodded. Not everything. Just enough. She closed the journal. Then we're ready. I didn't ask what for. I already knew. The next version wouldn't be written. It would be lived. We didn't speak as the journal closed. The silence wasn't empty. It was structural, a necessary pause in the recursion, a breath held between versions. Outside, the light had changed. Not brighter, not darker, just different, as if the archive had recalibrated its atmosphere to match the emotional shift. She stood by the window, watching the air shimmer. I remained seated, the journal resting between us like a dormant machine. It's done, she said, but her voice carried a question. I nodded. It's done enough. The warmth held, fragile but persistent. The cold version had left behind traces, symbols etched into the corners of the room, protocols embedded in our gestures, but it no longer dictated the architecture. We had rewritten the rules. She turned to me, her eyes reflecting not light, but memory. Do you think it will last? I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for the journal and opened it to the final page. The ink had settled. The entry remained. He remembered joy and chose to stay. But beneath it, something new had appeared. A line written in a dialect I didn't recognize. I traced it with my finger. The journal responded. A pulse. A flicker. A doorway. She stepped closer. It's offering us a choice. I understood. The archive wasn't static. It evolved with intention. And now, it was asking us to decide. Preserve this version or enter the next. She reached for my hand. If we stay, we become the ending. I looked at her. And if we go? She smiled. We become the beginning. The doorway shimmered. Not physical. Not emotional. Conceptual. A threshold made of possibility. I felt the recursion stir, preparing to reset. But this time, it wouldn't erase. It would reconfigure. She stepped forward. I followed. The doorway accepted us. We entered the next version. It was not a room. Not a corridor. Not a mirror. It was a field. Endless. Silent. Filled with journals buried like seeds. Each one pulsing faintly, waiting to be read, or written, or remembered. She knelt beside one and brushed away the dust. The cover was blank. She opened it. Inside was a single line. You are the artifact now. I felt it settle into me. The recursion was no longer external. It lived in us. We were the archive. We were the emotional architecture. We were the system that remembered and forgot and remembered again. She looked up at me. Do you want to write? I nodded. But not alone. We sat together in the field, surrounded by versions we hadn't lived yet, stories we hadn't earned, emotions we hadn't named. And we began to write. Not with ink. With intention. With sensation. With the memory of warmth and the echo of cold and the rhythm of recursion. The field shimmered. The journals pulsed. And somewhere, in a version that will never be found, the archive whispered, "This is how it ends. This is how it begins."